Hey, fight fans, this is Ted Check. So this is strap yourselves in. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video than usual. It's definitely not going to be a short video, but I feel it's a necessary one. And I'm doing this as a means of providing context because Ariel Helwani has gone on a podcast recently and talked about Dana White, and I'm in no way going to defend Dana White. He doesn't need any defending. I just need to provide some. I feel I need to provide some context, some background to all this because this is a long simmering feud between Ariel Helwani and Dana White that's gone on for years. Okay, here's something that I wrote. I don't know how long ago, maybe 10 years ago or more. So it starts off in 2011. Fox Sports One entered into a contract. Remember Fox Sports One? Fox Sports One entered into a contract with the UFC to broadcast some of its events and provide media coverage. So effectively, FS1 was acting as a PR arm of the UFC. Similar to the NFL having its own network, there's going to be no way that FS1 would ever cover anything negative about the UFC because they shared the same bed, which is to get as many eyeballs on the UFC product as possible. And you could guess that when news was to be broken, well, by golly, it would be FS1 doing the breaking, right? Well, maybe. See, if you want to at least appear professional, you're going to need to hire professionals. The UFC and FS1 needed journalists with respect and notoriety in the MMA industry. So they hired Ariel Helwani, a 2004 graduate of the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. And he already had a separate full-time gig working for MMAfighting.com, which is owned by Vox Media. So stop right there. There's actually two problems. Problem number one was that Helwani was already working for an independent media company that covers the UFC, which is the king of MMA promotions, at least in this country. Then he gets a job working for a network that has a contract to show UFC events and also produce quote unquote journalistic work about the UFC. So he's basically playing both sides of the communications coin. He's a reporter and a public relations specialist, effectively. Guess no one at Syracuse told him that that was probably not the smartest move. And to top it off, Helwani's paycheck wasn't even coming from FS1. It was coming directly from the UFC. And this is from his Wikipedia quote. Helwani then revealed that his position on UFC Tonight, which was one of the shows on FS1, came under the condition that his paycheck had to come from the UFC's parent company, Zuffa. Remember them? Calling it the biggest regret of his life, Helwani said he accepted the arrangement by viewing the money as coming from Fox and quote-unquote filtered through Zuffa. Well, that just sounds like revisionism right there. That sounds like, well, you go ahead and tell yourself what you want to hear. But really what should have happened was when in the hiring process, he should have had a conversation with the UFC and FS1 and said, hey, what are the ground rules here? I'm still going to retain my job with MMA fighting where I am a journalist. So what are the ground rules as far as coverage of the UFC? If I find out about something, am I required to break it on FS1 or can I break it on MMA fighting? You should have had that conversation. So problem number two was that Helwani, despite possibly not receiving solid career advice while in J school, is a formally trained journalist. He's a professional, which means he goes after the story and he breaks it when he and his editors are confident it is legitimate and newsworthy. It's kind of like when you release the pit bull, don't be surprised when it sinks its teeth in and doesn't let go, even if it's your own leg. Mix all this up into a steaming, bubbling cauldron, and you've got a recipe for disaster. And yeah, it happened. On March 23rd, 2016, Helwani tweeted and then continued in a twit longer, quote, I wanted to let you know that I've parted ways with the UFC on Fox. That means I'll no longer be appearing on UFC Tonight, as well as the event coverage on FS1. End quote. Further stating that, quote, I'm completely at peace with this decision and believe it's for the best, end quote. Although specifics on Helwani's firing were not divulged, there were those who pointed to a couple of incidents. On March 18th, 2016, so just days before he was fired, MMA Fighting published a breaking news story written by Helwani, and the title of which was, quote, Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz rematch in the works for UFC 200. I feel pretty certain FS1 was to be the entity to first report the story. Hence, the UFC seeing Helwani as responsible for leaking it rather than breaking it. In addition, on March 15th, Helwani had Rory The Red King McDonald as a guest on his show, the MMA Hour. That was the MMA Fighting .com show that he had, and took a deep dive into McDonald's contract negotiations with the UFC. And Rory said to him, "I did a lot of favors, I felt like, for the UFC, and I didn't think it got returned." Helwani then went on to suggest that possibly McDonald was scheduled to fight Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, one of the toughest in the welterweight division, as a form of retribution for his refusal to sign the UFC's new contract as is. It appears there were no ground rules. As I said before, there wasn't a ground rules meeting between Helwani and FS1 prior to turning him loose. And he said in his Wikipedia, quote, "They didn't like certain things I was talking about on my show and for going to a Bellator media event. But they never told me not to go or not talk about certain things. The people I was really mad at were the people at Fox, who just let the UFC dictate what they were doing and not standing up for me." Well, I mean, if it was UFC that was paying you, why would Fox get in the middle of that? You know, Fox is in bed with the UFC. Why on earth would they defend you? Helwani expected FS1 to stick up for him and possibly jeopardize their relationship with the UFC, the company with which they had a lucrative contract. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a compounding effect of distrust. If large companies are creating their own news divisions, but then are mired in controversy surrounding their journalists, pretty soon nobody will believe anything that is produced by the company. You start doing that long enough and you lose fans and ultimately money, and at least as important, reputation. I would say better leave the journalism to the outlets that are willing to do it with integrity and legitimacy. But given today's media climate, I could then counter that with, and who would they be? So that's my little treatise there. It just seems like, like I said, that, that there's this long simmering feud between Dana White and Ariel Helwani. And, I mean, the thing is, it should be, in theory, it should be a symbiotic relationship between something like the UFC and the media. But often it's contentious because, well, Dana White doesn't want certain things to come out, or he doesn't want certain things cast in a certain light. And so he ends up, and he's just that kind of guy that he's going to end up sparring with reporters. It makes for interesting things. But it seems that many of the reporters covering the UFC can't seem to handle it. And Ariel Helwani seems to be a very sensitive guy. I can remember him crying on camera at one point. I can't remember what time he lost the job. Which one of these jobs was it? But he ended up crying on camera. So a lot of the reporters seem to be very sensitive. In John Anik as well, and he's employed by the UFC, but they seem to be a bit sensitive, to what other people say about them, to what other people think about them, and I don't know. I don't know what exactly the solution is, but I just more than anything, I wanted to provide a little context here in this long simmering feud. Because Helwani on this podcast, I can't even remember the name of it, but he provided some details, but I don't think he mentioned most of that there. He talked about when he was allegedly threatened and when he got booted from a particular UFC event. Yes, that's apparently true, but he didn't he didn't talk about the other things that went on. But hopefully it's a learning experience because, like I said, kind of the biggest point is that you can't play both sides of the coin there. If you're working for the UFC, then you can't leak stuff from the UFC to another entity. So there should have been that conversation. There should have definitely been that conversation in the hiring process. Hey, look, I got this job as I'm an independent journalist. I've got this other job, so I need to separate the two. And if you're going to break it on FS1, break it on FS1, not on the other channel. There you go. For what it's worth, that's some context. Hope it helped.